Salut YouTube, how you doing? I am coming at you again from Paris. We're in our next Airbnb in a nice little studio apartment on the ground floor on the rez-de-chaussée. So we have just come up to Paris with the TGV. Long live the TGV. It was so nice and easy, honestly. You hop on the train in Avignon, you do some stuff on your computer, you watch, I don't know, an episode of something, or you listen to a podcast, and you basically arrive in Paris. Super easy. We've had an awesome weekend so far, catching up with friends, and I even met up with some of my Badass Careers clients. We did a picnic together. It's been very nice. So I'm coming at you again with a second round of a culture shock video since arriving back in France. So as you know, I'm back in France for 3 months, and this is the general rhythm that we hope to have, I guess, with life in general. It's been able to come back to France at least 3+ months per year to be able to share life between the two countries. But in saying that, it has been more than 3 years since we came back to France. So there have been some culture shocks, and I created, a video a few weeks ago on that. Definitely check out that because it's episode number 1 of this series. So just before I jump into the culture shocks, this is a shout out for my Francophiles out there. If you're someone interested in the French language and culture, I just wanted to let you know that the Lingoda sprint is happening, and you know that I used Lingoda to learn French myself. I used Lingoda to take my French level from level A2, B1 to really B2, C1, and I actually needed to pass an exam for the French nationality, and it enabled me to do that in just a few months. I've got lots of happy subscribers as well who are Lingoda graduates. I know a lot of you are big fans of Lingoda, but the sprint is particularly interesting because it's essentially a 2-month intensive language learning challenge, and if you do the sprint for 30 days for the full 2 months, you can get 100% cash back. So it's this really amazing, fun, engaging language learning challenge for yourself. And you can also do just 15 courses per month for the 2 months and still get 50% cash back as well if you attend all of your classes. And I think what makes Lingoda work so well is that it's completely online, it's super flexible, you can learn anytime, anywhere. You're connected with native professors from all around the globe, and they have super high quality materials and classes. You get to download the homework, you can take the resources for you to study later on, before, during, and after your class. And the other thing is it's not just French. You can learn English, business English, Spanish, or German as well. And it's just that ultimate mix of quality and flexibility. So if you are looking to take your language learning to new heights, Lingoda Sprint is definitely where it's at. It's such a cool way to kickstart things, to go from feeling like you've got some notions in the language to actually being conversational and comfortable with the language, or challenging yourself to get to that real level of perfection and fluency. One of the most important things we can do for ourselves when we're learning a new language is make it a habit, make it a discipline, and that's exactly what the sprint is doing. It's getting you into the rhythm of learning every single day. So if that sounds exciting to you, you can click the link below and use the code ROSIE09, and that will give you 20 euros or $25 US or equivalent off your sprint registration. The sprint is starting on October 3rd, so make sure you secure your spot as well, and let me know in a few months from now how you found it. So without further ado, let's jump into some of the reverse culture shocks that I have had coming back to France, this place that I have called home for 6 years before moving back to New Zealand a few years ago. Okay, so the first thing I have to say, and this is also because we're, starting to change our lifestyle a little bit in New Zealand, but there is so much meat in the diet. There is meat, you often eat meat for lunch and dinner, right? And it's like, even there's some meals where it's like, for example, melon jambon. This is a meal where you cut a melon, like a fruit, into different slices, and you eat it with charcuterie. So you're eating charcuterie and meat with fruit as a dish, as a meal. Meat has really found its way into the French culture, and in a way where French people really do like to eat all of the animal as well. You really see, even in your families, chopping up all these little bits and pieces of the chicken. Everything that's basically edible off the beast will be eaten. And you see this as well in them, it's pas de gaspillage, no wasting in the French culture. You see it happening in, pâté, taking parts of the animal to make pâté, etc., all these different ways to consume and eat meat. I think obviously, like most places in the world, this is changing a little bit, and that, going out in Paris, there are whole vegan menus now, veggie menus now at non-vegetarian restaurants. So in Paris, I feel like even 3 years ago, there used to be like vegetarian restaurants and then restaurants with one basic like veggie burger or something like that. Now on menus, you can have entire vegetarian parts of the menu. So it is definitely evolving, but it's such a meat heavy diet. Another thing I have to talk about here is the kids' schoolwork. It's impressive. It's a lot being a French kid. I think the amount of topics they need to learn and the quantity of things they need to learn. I mean, I could do a whole video on the French education style and my opinion on it, but basically it's a very much an input education system, in that the more information you can memorize and learn to then spit out in an exam, the better. So it's very much like learn a huge volume of information and learn that off by heart. And by the way, you're not just going to be doing like 5-6 subjects, you're going to be doing 9. From what I perceive, the level of schoolwork, the amount of schoolwork is much more significant compared to New Zealand, for example. In our culture, at 14, 15, 16, it would be very usual to have a job, to start working, whether that's in the supermarket, babysitter, whatever, just doing like, you know, gigs here and there. We actually have a youth wage, and it enables young people to start entering the workforce, getting experience and earning their own pocket money, earning their own cash. Whereas in France, I have the impression like you just wouldn't have the time for that. But honestly, in New Zealand, I feel like we were in class for the morning and then doing sports all afternoon until I was like 11. On this note, I always find it fascinating as a French culture shock around the approach to raising kids in general. I feel the parenting style, I mean, I've done a whole video on the parenting style, which I can link up here as well. But I would say in general, it's a more sort of what I would associate to being like a more old-fashioned, stricter style, like a style of maybe my grandparents. You nip it in the bud, like you're on the child's back, basically, like often and frequently when they're young, but it means that they have very like easy, respectful kids who can sit at the dinner table and not, you know, complain or butt into adult conversation or whatever, you know, for 3 hours at a time. Like they're very like well behaved later on. But to get there, it's just so fascinating. You do have to very quickly say like, no, stop, ça suffit. You really like don't put up with tantrums, you don't put up with, you know, any kind of bêtises. When the child starts to get a little bit worked up, you really do nip it in the bud. It is quite strict. There are very firm boundaries and rules, but the French philosophy around that, and I mean I can see where they're coming from, is that provides security to the child because they always know sort of what's expected of them and when. They're not the kinds of parents who will say like no, 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 and then like, okay, fine, you've complained enough, like I'm gonna give you the Coke or whatever, like, you know. It's like they're very much like no means no, and they really do stick to that. So like kudos to French parents, because I do think that they are in full-on training mode, really laying down the rules all the time. Like we don't do it like this way, we do it this way, etc, etc, etc. You say bonjour, you know, all of these kinds of rules. And eventually it means that, from my perspective, young kids are quote unquote, I mean, easier to deal with, or, you know, walk over them less as such. And this is slightly related to having kids as well, but what I find like just a big paradox in France is that you can be in a park in Paris and be completely topless, you can be topless at the beach, like that's no drama whatsoever, but you never see women breastfeeding, ever, publicly. Like in cafes, parks, it's just, I mean, given how small our population is in New Zealand and how often you'd see that versus like never seeing that in France, and there's still this thing like, oh, it's intimate, it's private, like, I don't know, it's like, are we sure it's really about that, or is it that, you know, breast is sexualized? I don't know, it's just like, I find it quite interesting that you can be so open and like, yeah, women should be able to go topless, but when it comes to breastfeeding, it's suddenly like, oh no, like, you know, we would, you know, you wouldn't do that, that wouldn't be nice for other people if you did that in public. Like, I find that very paradoxical. The next culture shock, I mean, I knew this about France, but oh my gosh, people urinating on the streets. I mean, in Paris you see all these little like lines of water on the ground and you're like, oh, has someone watered a plant? No, they've watered the wall with their penis. They do pee on the corners of buildings, on the street, and the worst is around train stations. Every train station in France, you walk out, it's not just Paris, I mean it's the south, it's everywhere. The smell of urine is quite specific. I got to a point where I went to Gare de Lyon and I went to the corner of like a, you know, the area outside to go and take a photo of a pretty view of a pretty building, and the smell hit me so hard because it was summer and it just like it hit me. I almost vomited on the street, like I was like gagging, like I could barely stand up. I just like, not to be a drama queen, but I was like, oh my god. But it's a thing, it's like almost like everyone can agree that you just, if it's a train station, time to go hard, like you just pee straight outside. Straight outside. Another thing in France that I've noticed is definitely there's more, you know, a vibe in Paris especially, or bigger cities, Marseille for sure, sexual harassment and the male gaze. You will be stared at as a woman, you know, even, I mean, it's not that, like, not that women who dress a certain way or look a certain way are ever asking for it, but like like to a surprising extent where you genuinely look like crap and you're just like out on the street like whatever, and still the stares, the comments, the remarks, it's definitely, I would say, in terms of frequency in the population, I find it quite specific, and I've had other friends travel to Marseille specifically and be like, whoa, okay, like I really felt the male gaze while I was in the city. Another thing that I've really encountered for the first time and discovered in France on this trip has been inheritance tax. Like, we don't have inheritance tax in New Zealand. It means that, you know, if your parents pass away and they leave you a house, that's your house. You know, if they've paid off the house, like, it becomes your house. In France, that's not the case. So for example, when Nils' father passes away and we go to inherit his home, we would have to pay tax on that. And it's not, because it's France, it's not just a small amount of tax, it's a large amount of tax. So we actually have to plan financially to save potentially, you know, well over like 100,000 euros, for example, to be able to inherit that house, even if there's zero money owed on it. I'm thinking about people who, you know, don't earn much money, for example. They may not be able to afford to inherit that home. They may not be able to pay the tax on a freehold asset, on an asset that owes zero money to the bank. They may not be able to afford to inherit that, so they'll have to sell it. Then you pay, you know, the tax, plus you pay all the fees, etc. to sell it, and you'd have to downsize. So you may not be able to inherit your family home if you can't afford the tax. And I find that, I get it, I understand why it exists. It exists because, you know, it's unfair that, you know, wealth just gets handed down and handed down and handed down. But I did find that really shocking. It's just something that's completely the other way around in New Zealand. Another thing I was quite impressed with France, I have to say, I have to admit, there are QR codes everywhere, and this started with COVID not giving out menus, but you go to a restaurant now and you just scan a QR code and you look at the menu, and there's no paper menus anymore basically, and you're just looking at the menu, you choose your thing. This is very much in Paris, and you can scan the QR code again, pay on your mobile. For France, honestly, I'll admit it, quite impressed. That's quite digitally savvy, if I do say so myself. Another thing that is so French, this is very funny, is the way they describe houses and the way they talk about them. When you talk about the price of a house, they don't actually care about the price itself, with it just say it's €1,000,000. Everything is in meters squared, and it completely makes sense, right? It's like, you know, you can't compare apples with oranges, it's all about the size. But what's interesting is, like, you'll be talking about different areas of Paris and you'll be like, well, it's 14,000 euros per square meter now. And, you know, whereas in this suburb, it's 9,000 per square meter. And so this is how people are talking about real estate. And another thing that I find quite interesting is they say, like, when you have deux pièces, you'd think that means 2 rooms, but what they mean is 2 rooms. So like lounge and bedroom would be deux pièces, T2. So if you actually want an apartment with 2 bedrooms, you get a 3 pièces, a 3 pièces. Another thing I find is that when French people eat, okay, I feel like they eat really separately, because you usually have like entree, main, dessert. And so when you go to eat your entree, maybe you have just a salad, and then for your main you have just a piece of meat, or maybe a piece of meat plus some potatoes or something, but very little things. Like, you know, you don't often have a lot of things on the plate at once, and then you do the cheese, and then you do the dessert. And what's quite interesting with that is that I feel like in New Zealand you put everything on the plate at once. You'll have your meat, you'll have your salad, you'll have your potatoes, for example, and what you do is you kind of stack things. So you have a little bit of salad, a little bit of potato, a little bit of meat on the fork, and you stack that, and you stack different flavors and different textures and different sensations together on your plate, and you eat that on the fork. It's almost like the fork is becoming like a mini like brochette, like a mini kebab. Whereas here, because you do eat, you know, sort of drawn out step by step, I find that even when you have separate things on the plate, so a piece of meat plus some lentils plus some broccoli, just for example, French people will eat bit by bit. They'll eat the lentils, they'll eat the meat, and it's like they don't do the stack. So for example, I made a kind of like open pita sandwich with some falafel, some homemade hummus, some salad and that kind of stuff. And the idea is that, like, obviously you almost have like, you know, some falafel with a bit of the hummus or a bit of the salad, and you kind of eat it like that. And my beau-père was like, and he would like eat the hummus by itself. You know, so it's like, I think there's this unease with stacking things. It's quite separated. It makes me think of those like toddler plates where everything's kind of separate. The French also have a completely different approach to COVID. I understand that New Zealand is like en retard, we're running a bit late, and that like COVID really came into the community a lot later than the general population in Europe and that kind of thing, and Europeans seem to have moved on. But I was shocked to not have to wear a mask in the airport, to not have to wear a mask on flights. Like, it's just, I mean, coming all the way from New Zealand, it was always mask on the flights, mask on the airports, like in Sydney, in Singapore, in London, and then you get to France and it's just that much more relaxed around the masks, and people just aren't wearing them anywhere. Something else is when you pay for things in France, when you pay in cash, just say something is $5.40, like in New Zealand you just give a 10 euro note or do a $10 note, right, and you get the change. Whereas whenever you go to pay in cash in France, they're like, do you have the 40 cents? Okay, I get it, I guess it makes something cleaner, but it's like they're almost hesitant to take a note and just give you the cash. I mean, it doesn't make the calculation is obviously done for you on the screen. It doesn't make it harder to grab €5.60. They ask for that every time you pay in cash. Another thing I have to mention here is, this is super cute, but French people don't say LinkedIn, you know, like the professional networking site LinkedIn, they say LinkedIn. And it actually LinkedIn means like, you know, you're in the loop, you're linked in, you're in the network, someone's linked you into the conversation, right? Like linked is a word, but French people were like, no, it's LinkedIn, and so they say LinkedIn. And it's really sweet. Another French culture shock, and this is something that I really struggle with, but I got shushed as an adult woman just on the street. We were actually at a port, so it was like a public area just with 3 girlfriends. We were laughing away, and we had our bikes, we were pushing our bikes and walking along the port, and a man sitting on a bench turned around, he was probably in his 50s, and he was like, shh. And he shushed us as if we were babies. Firstly, this is a public arena, so if you wanted to go somewhere quiet, go to a library, go to, you know what I mean, like we're at the port. But secondly, like, getting shushed isn't rare. You can get shushed on trains, you get shushed in stores, you can get shushed, you know, like French people will not hesitate to shush another adult human being. I mean, you can shush people, I guess, who are chatting behind you in a movie or something in New Zealand, but in general public, you do not shush other adults. It just, ça se fait pas ça, like that just does not happen. Okay, friends, well, I hope that you enjoyed this next collection of culture shocks. Let me know which ones you can relate to the most down below, or which ones surprised you, or which ones you've experienced yourself. Otherwise, I hope that you are having a lovely summer or winter, depending on which hemisphere you are in, and I'll see you next time on the Not Even French YouTube channel. A bientôt!